It's interesting when the Scottish Government just now particularly is very much emphasising kind of place-based learning, place-based theory, and thinking about trying to kind of reduce the inequalities between communities and societies within Scotland. And it's interesting when you're in a space like this and you get to see the different derelict buildings and hear the amazing stories of like really integral parts of Glasgow and people's stories and context. It really brings a light to the fact that civic pressure and people getting together and sharing stories and experiences is one way we can really help to push Glasgow in the right direction and make sure that all of these different buildings can maybe hopefully one day follow suit in terms of the Govan Hill. Now they've got the happy stories, so I mean there is a precedence there, so that's brilliant. So going on to talk about our next speaker now. So Elspeth King, as I said earlier on, is from Friends of the People's Palace and Winter Garden and Glasgow Green. And I'm sure most of you will know that just now there's a kind of long-going campaign in relation to improving, protecting and boosting the kind of finances and just overall support within the People's Palace. There's been a lot of controversy recently, particularly within that area in the Carlton. There's the new Gaelic school that's getting lots and lots of money invested in it, which has only angered a lot of people, I think, within the community. My own gran, she lives in the Carlton, and I know it's been like a big thing for her in the community that she lives in, of why there's this brilliant big Gaelic school in the middle of Carlton, the People's Palace, which is such an amazing building. Again, everybody has ties to, everybody's got a story of going to Glasgow Green at one point and seeing the People's Palace, the Winter Garden. It resonates quite a lot, I think, for people in Glasgow. So hopefully Elspeth is going to talk us more about the campaign and how things are going. So please welcome Elspeth.
Thank you very much, and great thanks to the new Glasgow Society for this project, which I think is wonderful. We don't talk about derelict buildings as much as we should in the positive ways about which they should be talked, and the message doesn't get through. So hopefully this will kickstart something big. I've got a dog in this fight. I used to work at the People's Palace and I know it intimately, back to front. And the story about this particular derelict building is a derelict building with a difference. Now it's different because Glasgow City Council has spent an awful lot of money in making it derelict since the closure of the Winter Gardens on 31st December 2018. It's also different as Glasgow museums have been trying to shed the building since about 1949, and Glasgow Parks Department and their successors have been trying to demolish the Winter Garden half since 1966. It's not a building that is well liked by the authorities. Now, I should say that the People's Palace has many similarities with the Mars Govan Hill Baths, not least of which is that they are by the same architect, Alexander Beath MacDonald, who lived 1847 to 1915. A.B. MacDonald ran the City Architects Department from 1890 to 1914, and before that he worked under James Cleland there and was responsible for a very large number of public buildings, including most of the City Improvement Trust tenements in the city centre, Rockhill and Belvedere hospitals, Springburn and Maryhill fire stations, various libraries and public baths, and the lovely red sandstone police office which sits derelict in St Andrews Square in Turnbull Street at this very time. Many of MacDonald's buildings have been neglected, found to be surplus to requirements and demolished. Locherbrig's red sandstone was his favourite building material, and it gives great quality to our cityscape. Neglect or demolish MacDonald's buildings and you tear the heart out of Glasgow. Now if you go further along the street outside Dumbarton Road, he built the Partick pumping station, which is sitting semi-derelict on the other side of the bridge over the Kelvin. Now take away that building and you'll destroy the sightline of red sandstone which runs there for many bays to the Kelvin Hall and to Kelvin Grove itself. Passing Kelvin Grove, he built the bridge on Kelvin Way, and he employed Paul Montfort on the sculpture. Now, Montfort couldn't get work here after the Great War. He emigrated to Australia and became a major sculptor, doing many of the national monuments of Australia. So MacDonald did a lot of good work, and he was also responsible for the Botanic Gardens gates and the two charming gatehouses, and I think one of them is under threat at the moment. Now, MacDonald was an architect engineer who delivered quality public buildings in this city, yet his name is virtually unknown. Often think about Glaswegians, they can't name more than 2 architects at a time. Charles Litt, Rennie Mackintosh and Greig Thompson. You know, our architecture history is not well known enough. It was MacDonald who engaged James Boyd of Paisley, the glasshouse specialists, whose best known surviving structures are now the Palm House of the Dublin Botanical Gardens at Glasnevin and the Pearson Conservatory for Port Elizabeth, South Africa, 1882, and also the Fernery at Ascog, which some of you may know. These works by Boyd of Paisley went worldwide, and it was Boyd's firm who was entrusted to move the Kibble Palace to its present site in Botanic Gardens in 1873. What I'm trying to gather together and say in summary is that both parts of the People's Palace are quality buildings and aesthetically pleasing constructions. Now, I went to work at the People's Palace in 1974, and I was told that it was an inadequate building in an undesirable area, and the museums wanted out of it as soon as possible. So the first few years of my working life were going around other derelict buildings like the fish market, etc., thinking, where can we go? I found that nothing which was on offer could match what the People's Palace had to offer. Now, the Winter Gardens at this time were still closed from 1966 to 78, as the then Director of Parks, Arthur Oldham, had planned to demolish many Glasgow glasshouses, not just the Winter Gardens, but a lot of the other glasshouses, on the grounds that they were old-fashioned and nobody went there. Apparently the trouble on the green was that the wrong people were sitting on the benches in the Winter Gardens. So they cleared out all the benches and nobody sat down, but then when you went in, there was nothing to do and nobody visited, and it was as quick as they could get out. So, of course, Arthur Oldham was rewarded for his services to Glasgow with the Mungo Prize and an Order of the British Empire when he retired. I worked at the People's Palace for 16 years, and the threat of demolition and redevelopment were never far away, starting with the Glasgow Eastern Area Renewal Scheme, and then there was the east flank of the inner ring road designed to cut through the green between the People's Palace and Nelson's Monument, joining up with the Salt Market. After that, there was the Garden Festival proposal. It was to come to Glasgow Green, and the People's Palace was to be its administrative headquarters. That fell through because they discovered that Glasgow Green didn't qualify, as it wasn't derelict enough. And I kept wondering, will we be prohibited from exhibiting here in the new Glasgow Society because the People's Palace still isn't derelict enough? But we got in. There's various other privatisation schemes come up that we had to fight, but not until the fire escape was added in 1989 was the People's Palace free from the threat of closure and demolition. Now, work at the People's Palace in those years of comprehensive redevelopment for so many areas in Glasgow involved a lot of architectural retrieval, and we built up superb collections of Glasgow tile work from shops and closes, Glasgow stained glass from houses, public buildings and churches, and material ranging in social scale from a model lodging house booth from the Carlton in Abercrombie Street to a state-of-the-art Victorian bathroom from a mansion house in Blythewood Square. Now, none of this has been seen in the last 30 years, and if you're thinking of taking the Twilight tour of the tiles collection, which is being offered by Glasgow Life in the Kelvin Hall soon. Don't bother unless you already have a ticket, because I think all 16 places have been sold out, and really it's awful when you think big collections kept hidden, only a few folks seeing them at a time. It's ridiculous. But I've not come here to moan, I promise you. The People's Palace, when functioning at its best, was a wonderful operation, showing Glasgow to the world and the world to Glasgow. The Winter Gardens is ideal for displaying sculpture, and after Kelvin Grove was built there across the road, the full-sized maquette for George Frampton's statue of St Mungo was shown in the Winter Gardens. We've got a historical postcard to prove it, and in 1988 we found the sawn-off heads of the 3 figures in the Parks Department depot on the green. The thing had just collapsed and they sawed the heads and kept the heads. Still speaking of sculpture, the late George Wiley had a very successful exhibition in the Winter Gardens, and the then Friends bought his legendary Great British Slap and Tickle machine for the entertainment of visitors. Shortly afterwards, the Kelvin Grove copy of the 12-foot high classical statue of Antinous, lover of the Emperor Hadrian, as an Egyptian pharaoh, was shown. He was magnificent, real beautiful work. He not only fitted wonderfully well among the palm trees, but he gave the message to Glasgow's gay community, which was just emerging at that time, that gay history was not going to be ignored in Glasgow or at the People's Palace. Now, originally, the Winter Gardens was built as a hall for music, and in the last 120 years, music of all kinds has been played there. It was the base for the Glasgow International Folk Festival during the 1980s, and groups came from many countries to perform inside and also outside on the green. You might be wondering what happened to that. Well, it was all run by volunteers, and it was so successful that Glasgow Council saw there was money to be made in folk music. So in 1994, the Celtic Connections Festival, based in the new concert hall, took over, and the rest is history. The volunteers disappeared. Now, you might be wondering what the difference is between the Winter Gardens and other Glasgow glasshouses. The presentation was that of a temperate climate, and the minute you walked through the doors, regardless of the temperature outside, you had that warm embrace of the atmosphere, combined with the uplifting health-giving viridity of the living plants. But you also had the opportunity of encountering what it means and what it meant to be a Glaswegian through various aspects of the museum collection being displayed there, often co-curated by museums and parks. For example, one long-term display was that of the stained glass designed by Stephen Adam and rescued from the St Ninian's Wine Church in Gorbals. It showed the fruits and flowers of the Bible, and the park staff provided detailed botanical descriptions of each panel. Glasgow-made cast iron was also regularly shown in the gardens. New Glaswegians from the Indian continent immediately felt at home here, as did the Afro-Wegians and all others, because it was a palace for the people. The People's Palace is in Glasgow, of Glasgow and about Glasgow. And our plea isn't for bricks, mortar, red sandstone and glass-filled cast iron, though it should be noted that these things are not as bad as the council would have you believe. It's about the history of the city of Glasgow and Glasgow's material culture, which has been underfunded, neglected and locked up for decades. Commitment to Glasgow history, all our collective histories, needs to be restored. So I say, let Glasgow flourish with the restoration of the People's Palace and fresh looks at the history of Glasgow, and thank you very much for listening.